Hi and welcome to this video. My name is Yannis and I want to share with you how you can create some sort of electronica IDM beat with a Perfourmer and also how you can turn it into a full arrangement. And it's like a beat with different parts. So for example, one synthesizer is like a kick drum. Then we also have some sort of hi-hat. A bass. And some melodic sequence. And this is actually a song of my new album Morning Cycles, which you warmly invite you to listen to because all you hear on that album is the Perfourmer. It's the result of some creative sessions where I was sitting down and created little patches like this and also quickly turned them into arrangements. So I wanted to avoid overthinking. I simply tried to create sounds and to quickly turn them into like a little song. And that's what I did on the album. And because it's such an enjoyable process to work like this with the Perfourmer, I also thought I want to make a little video series sharing like some tutorials on sound design, but also on making full tracks. And if you're new to this video series, I'm going to link it in this info box. You can also see that I'm using the individual outputs because this means that I can send any individual synthesizer into reverb. So for example, the first one has a lot of reverb. The kick drum doesn't have so much reverb and you can actually apply different types of effects. So that's actually a super amazing way to work with it, that you can treat them independently. And also, I don't know if you noticed, but this example was in 7/4, or you can also think of 7/8, which is something I also really enjoy, making electronic music in odd time signatures. And let's maybe start with the kick drum for getting a better understanding of that feel. So here you can see the pattern. It's like some syncopated rhythm, and I'm going to turn on the click so you can hear it in relation to the time signature. It's in 7/4 now. And it's super fun and intuitive to create patterns like this because all you need to do is create a new MIDI clip and make sure it's in 7/4 or 7/8. And then you either leave one position free of the 16th note grid, 2 positions free, or 3 positions free, and just draw a couple of notes. So it could, for example, look like that. I have no idea how this is going to sound like, but I'm quite sure it's a cool rhythm. I kind of like it. And sound-wise, you can see that I'm using a sine wave with some pitch envelope, and I actually explained in the first video about basic sound design how you can make drum sounds, so be warmly invited to check it out if you want to learn some more about that. Otherwise, let's check out the noise part, because there's some fun stuff to do as well. And inside Ableton, let's basically create some 16th notes, because you maybe remember that there were some accents, but there's a technique for making it, we draw those. So like this, the noise is super static and you can use velocity for bringing in some variations. So let's edit all notes, bring down the velocity, and it's always like the third note that basically has a higher velocity. So we need to manually do it. And we can further enhance this effect by using different pitches. So if we move the accents, so we have to select all of them. For example, 1 octave higher to the C4. And here you need to also make sure that you use keyboard tracking, which is this knob, because if this is at 0, we will get the same sound. But if we open it, we get more of the filter, so the filter will open more for the higher pitch, because now the filter reacts to the pitch, and this way we get a brighter sound. Which is a fun trick for making some more interesting noise figures. And while the kick drum plays this super syncopated rhythm, the noise hi-hat gives some sort of stability to it, because it's some repetitive pattern. Let's continue with the melodic sequence because it's also based on some particular rhythmic idea which is using groups of 3. And groups of 3 are super amazing because in many scenarios they create some interesting counter rhythm to your main pulse, so your music gets more interesting rhythmically. And if you're also in some odd meter, it can actually get even more interesting, which is potentially happening here. So you can create groups of 3 by simply creating inside a MIDI grid, for example with 16th notes, a group of 3, like for example this. And then you need to repeat it a couple of times. So you can select all notes, press Command D in Ableton, for example, and just duplicate it a couple of times. And you will see it doesn't fit into one bar. So you can either think of something you do in the end as some sort of variation, or you simply duplicate it more times until you're at the 1 again. But here I was actually choosing the variation, and let's actually check the whole sequence because otherwise it's a bit complicated to explain. So you can see that I start with this motive. The notes are actually a bit shorter because I played this live on my drum pad, which sends out very short triggers. And actually it's also part of a little sequence pack. You can see Lydian, it's Lydian 16, so Lydian sequence. And in case you're interested, I'm going to link it down below in the description. I created like a MIDI sequence pack, humanly played with my drum pad, lots of sequences in different scales. It's I think it's actually great for also getting quickly into creating a piece of music without having to do all the composition stuff. But just as a side note, so here you can see that this group of 3 repeats itself. And then in the end of the second bar, actually in 7/8, we have 2 additional notes, and then it basically continues to repeat. And then we are at the middle of the whole sequence, and then I changed the lowest note from C to B. And I find this to be a super great idea for sequences if you want to make it a bit more interesting instead of just looping 1 or 2 bars to, after for example 4 bars, move the lowest note to another position, because the lowest note always sounds like some sort of bass note, although it's not in the bass register, and adds a lot of variation to the whole sequence. So let's listen to the whole sequence without all the other parts. With the click. Once you have a sequence that is based on some very strong rhythmic idea, you can create variations of it for making your piece of music more interesting. And actually you will see in the intro of the song, when we look at the arrangement in a second, that I did exactly that, but I want to show you some example of it already now. So if you mute, for example, the B, C, and E, it's you get some very interesting rhythm that positively confuses you, because it sounds kind of interesting, but you try to get the rhythm, the beat, but it's not really possible. And this way you keep your listener engaged if you start a composition like that. Let's actually listen to this without the click. Has so much tension. And a melodic sequence like this really benefits from some deep, long bass lines. So here you can see that the notes are being held for a very long time, actually 4 bars. There's 4 bars of C, 4 bars of B, so very little movement. Again, the C, and in the end, I also go to the E. But there's not much happening. The sound is super simple, just some really low note that gets sustained, but it's just really efficient. Now let's check out the arrangement, and I hope I can explain it properly, because it can look a bit confusing, because you need to send out MIDI, which you can see here. So it's the melody, the bass, the clap, hi-hat, noise, whatever. I don't know why I called it clap, and the kick. And then we also have some audio tracks where we actually receive the audio, because we need audio tracks, otherwise we only have MIDI. And those are here. And there are actually some automations I'll get into in a second. But you can actually see the intro pretty well, because here I'm using a clip that only uses those upper 3 notes, and those lower 3 notes are actually muted, like I've shown you in this quick example. And if you have a part that is rhythmically really captivating, you don't need to do so much. So you basically start with the sequence. Give the listener some time to understand the rhythm or to not understand the rhythm. And then once the hi-hat comes in, it helps a little. Now we still have the kick drum to bring in, which also adds some new development to the whole track. It still sounds quite dry without the bass though, which is why in a second the bass comes in and also brings in some kind of sensation. Actually, you could include a little drop here, but I didn't do it. Now for the bass. It also adds some new perspective to the melody, and it just sounds really exciting if you bring in the bass a little later and kind of save up the moment where you bring in the bass. And now this continues a little. And now we have to move to the audio tracks, because you can see the melody comes through this audio channel and it has some automation. And now it's going to be muted, and you'll see in a second why. Now there's some crystallizer coming in. And I have to pause here, it doesn't sound so smooth. I had to recreate this track kind of, so it's not sounding exactly like the main track. So you're warmly invited still to listen to the album. It's the second track called Monula. And you see I have 2 more channels here. So if I take away the automation, so it's melody, the clap, hi-hat, noise, call it what you want, bass, drum. And then there's a crystallizer. It's from Sound Toys. It's a very fun effect. Also a little delay after it, but the crystallizer is like the main effect here. And also, I always, or not always, but often have a channel with Black Hole from Eventide, because it's a super charismatic reverb. And I just added those 2 tracks, so you can see that they receive the audio from the same channel as the melody, but with 100% effect, so I can simply bring them in sometimes. And that's also why I didn't just interrupt the MIDI clip here, because I still need the MIDI to be sent to the crystallizer and the Black Hole, which gets introduced a little later. But that's also a nice drop if you take away the main sequence and just use it in a kind of modified way, or being sent through some very drastic effect. I think in the mix I made the crystallizer a bit louder at this part, but then it's basically the volume it has later, because otherwise it sounds too distracting from the main sequence. So this is like a little interlude basically, and the other instruments just keep playing, but it's enough to have this drastic change of the main sequence. And then when the main sequence comes back in, I use some other variation. This is also super fun, and I didn't show you this yet, because you can change the chance for individual notes. And you can see that the notes you heard before, like the upper 3 notes, have a 100% chance, so you always hear them. And now those other 3 notes, which were previously muted, now have a 20% chance. So still we don't hear them so often, but every 5th time, or with a 20% chance, we hear them. So we slightly create some build-up, and I feel like this is some super amazing tool to use, so that you basically use your sequence and slightly increase the probability to create some stronger build-up. something else happening. Something I really like to do for, again, increasing the tension. As you can see, the only thing that actually does something is the main sequence. The other parts just keep the groove. And I kind of like how changing only one thing or making changes to one thing can add some very natural development to the music. And here's this trick of using random, which is a MIDI effect in Ableton. You can find it under MIDI effects here. And if you set choices to 1 and scale to 12, it will mean that it occasionally drops in some octaves. So here with a 28% chance, and you see I automated this. So actually, if you check the automation, you can see that the random gets turned on here. And somehow I always feel like adding those occasional octaves at random positions sounds incredibly musical compared to being more free in the tone choice. I mean, you can see I still have some scale plugin for the Lydian scale here. I think for octaves, we actually don't need it. But just as some example, now we have some more free variations, which will be in scale, but still it can quickly sound too random to my ears. And now as the next development, we're at the full sequence with full probability. So here you can see the chance is all on 100%. And then it's like the full sequence. Actually, let's check the transition. So here we're still at the 20% chance for some note kind of arrangement. So now that's kind of the climax. And here I also started playing a bit with the filter. Maybe it was even a bit more closed before. Then you can nicely open it, close it, add some live variation. And it's also great to increase the release. Has this nice open sound. Also I like opening the attack a little. Then we have the outro, where basically the drums stop. And I just closed the filter a little. It's a very natural sound. And you just let it float out together with the bass. And just as a little wrap up, so you start with the sequence in the more mysterious way, taking off some notes. You bring in the hi-hat, you bring in the drum, you bring in the bass. Then you mute, actually it's here, the main sequence and introduce this sequence through the effect with 100%. Afterwards, the effect stays in the arrangement, but I just make it a little softer, otherwise it just sounds too distracting. Then we open up the sequence a little with those additional 20% chance notes. We bring in the octaves, and then we have the full sequence still with the octaves and add the live manipulation. And somehow this is enough for making this some interesting arrangement, at least to my taste. And that's the end of this little video series, and thank you so much for being with me. I really hope you learned something and found this interesting. Again, we warmly invite you to listen to the album and see if you can maybe hear some of the things I explained, or maybe it makes more sense and hopefully also inspires you to play around with your own ideas and to turn those approaches into your own songs. And if you feel like, okay, this was a very cool video series and how can I maybe support this guy, or how can I say thanks, be known that on Bandcamp you get twice as many tracks as on Spotify, Tidal, etc. So the regular album has like 5 tracks, but on Bandcamp I have 5 more tracks, maybe even a little more experimental. And so buying it on Bandcamp is just a very great and sweet way for saying thanks, and you even get some more tunes. Otherwise, here's once more the link to the whole playlist, and here is another playlist with more general music production tips, but you can perfectly apply them to your Perfourmer or your music production setup. And apart from that, I wish you lots of inspiration with whatever it is that you create, and hope to see you soon again at this channel. Bye!